Well, first of all, I want to welcome the fact that this is an expansive budget, which is the proper way to go. You can't cut your way out of a crisis like this. Obviously, you've got to spend your way out. I welcome the support for business, particularly the extension of the tax warehousing scheme and the commercial rates remission. But I have a number of questions in relation to the new scheme called the CRSS, I think it is. It's the amount payable depends on your turnover during a corresponding period in 2019. I know a number of people who have actually set up businesses pre-COVID in 2020. So how is their payment going to be calculated? Secondly, would I be right in thinking that this isn't a direct grant aid? It's more a liquidity situation whereby it's an advance on your tax credits. So the more you get, the higher tax you will pay at some time in the future. And speaking of liquidity, I very much regret the fact that the banks have failed, in my view, to play their part in relation to releasing liquidity for small businesses. I recall being part of a government that was forced to pay 60 billion net taxpayers' money to bail out the banks. The banks now, in return, are very remiss when it comes to bailing out the people. Most of the representations I've got from small business and from the business particularly affected by the pandemic have related to the TWSS. Most of them demanded or requested that the TWSS be restored in its original form, and they said that was the difference between survival and extinction. Now, that hasn't been done, and I regret that. It has been replaced by the EWSS, which is only half as good and twice as difficult to access. And I note that the Minister said yesterday in his speech that when the EWSS runs out, I think in April, that he's going to replace it with another scheme. He didn't say he was going to continue it as it is. He says he's going to replace it with another scheme. And, you know, I'd like the Minister to give me an assurance when he's replying to this debate that the new scheme, the new replacement scheme, won't be less generous than the present EWSS, which is in itself is far less generous than the TWSS. I welcome the increases in social welfare. However, I have to say that in relation to the increasing the fuel allowance and the other measures that were in there to offset the increase in carbon tax, there's a substantial cohort. Time doesn't permit me to go into it in detail, but there's a substantial cohort of people in receipt of social welfare who will not benefit from any of those measures. So are they supposed to suck up the increase in carbon tax? I also want to welcome the government honouring its commitment to retain the old age pension at 66. And that is a very costly measure. Nevertheless, I'd like to ask the Minister if he can give me an assurance that the early retirement allowance, which was promised on page 75 of the programme for government, is going to be introduced in the social welfare bill, because there was no mention of that in the budget. I also want to say that I regret the fact that there are no general increases for the second year in a row in social welfare rates, because experience has shown that when social welfare rates fall behind increases elsewhere in the economy, you widen inequality, you increase inequality, and you increase poverty. And that is a reality. We have 690,000 people living in this country below the poverty line, and we have the second highest rate, I think, of child poverty in the OECD. And I hope that when we are standing up next year, debating next year's budget, that those figures have not increased. Just a final point, Cathaoirleach. The Minister for Finance yesterday adverted to the fact that the large spending was offset to some extent by savings. And true, there has been a huge build-up in savings since the onset of the COVID. What is lacking, I find, in the budget is a scheme to help unlock those savings for the benefit of the Irish economy. And I'd like to ask the Minister, is it proposed to have such a scheme?
Thank you.